Good evening. Let's try that one more time. Good evening. There it is. Good evening. Welcome to Planet Word. My name is Britt Oates, Manager of Public Programs, and we are super excited, all of us here at Planet Word, to welcome you to tonight's programming event. As part of our Having Hard Conversations series, this is Talk That Matters, an evening with Jenn White. Now, tonight's program will include a discussion between Jenn White, host of WAMU's 1A, distributed by NPR, and moderated by NPR's executive producer of booking and specials, Natalie Winston. And now, to introduce our esteemed guests, please join me in welcoming Planet Word's founder and CEO, Ann Friedman.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out on this cold night for another in our series of programs called Having Hard Conversations. We know the topic tonight will probably warm all of us up. As you know, Planet Word, we dive into all the ways that people use words in prose, poetry, oratory, lyrics, advertising, and in all our spoken interactions. At Planet Word, we fundamentally believe in the need to use our words, however we use them, to build community. Especially right now, when there are so many differing perspectives about almost every issue confronting us Americans. Immigration, foreign policy, the economy, the Supreme Court, redistricting, health policy. It's more important than ever that we be able to talk things out civilly and try to find common ground. Helping us do that tonight and every weekday is Jenn White. Day after day, Jenn fearlessly tackles the most divisive, fraught issues of the day on her talk show 1A on WAMU. I am the lucky person who commutes to Planet Word almost every morning while 1A is on the radio. So thanks to tuning into Jenn and her guests, I get to learn about all these important issues and marvel at her skill in asking just the right questions to enlighten her listeners, debunk misinformation, and clarify issues. Jenn never pulls punches, and I can always hear the smile or concern in her voice. Jenn has worked in public radio since 1999, working at WBEZ Chicago on several shows, plus appearing on podcasts with famous Chicagoans like the Obamas and Oprah. And before that, she worked as the local host of All Things Considered at Michigan Radio. She's a skilled public speaker and has moderated numerous on-air gubernatorial and mayoral debates. Jenn is a native of Detroit, but she now lives in Washington, D.C., where she has quickly become an essential voice of our community. And isn't that what public radio is all about? Community. Indeed, when we first moved to Washington after living overseas for a decade, it was WAMU's hosts who introduced me to local politics and issues and made me feel at home. So thank you for carrying on that great WAMU tradition, Jenn. And interviewing Jenn is Natalie Winston, who I should mention, for those of you who don't know, is our daughter. That means she grew up hearing lots of conversations about hard topics every single night at the dinner table. She wanted to work in journalism, even back in middle and high school. Some of her friends from there are right here tonight. And at her college graduation, she was named Community Builder of the Year. She had learned early on how to listen and balance the news and respect diverse viewpoints. Natalie is currently the executive producer of Booking and Specials at NPR and has worked on everything from All Things Considered to Morning Edition to Talk of the Nation. So we have real pros on stage with us tonight. We heartily welcome them both and thank WAMU for its on-air support of this series and other Planet Word programs. And we thank the IBIS Group for funding the Having Hard Conversations series. We are particularly eager, Jenn, to hear your reflections on your career and your wisdom about how to engage in these tough, all-important conversations. So welcome to you and welcome to Jenn and Natalie to Planet Word.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Natalie Winston. Thank you, Jenn, for being part of this important conversation.
My pleasure.
So this series, as we just heard, is called Having Hard Conversations. And one of the reasons that I know Planet Word wanted to invite you here is because if you listen to your show, it's obvious there's almost no subject that's too hard for you to handle. Where did you learn to do that?
Wow. I think I wouldn't say there's no subject that's too hard to handle. There are conversations we've had on the program that have been incredibly difficult. And I have not fared well on the other end of those discussions. There are certain conversations, one in particular I remember when we were talking about a form of sexual assault. And the last piece of engagement we received from a listener was it was so devastating. I finished reading it, and I still had to do the end credits, and I was crying. And just choked my way through, and at the end, just kind of dissolved into tears. And the hour two was probably a movie club conversation, you know? So I have 6 minutes to make a really hard turn. And the thing that got me from the first conversation to the second was my team. The producer came in the studio and hugged me. Our then midday host, Jerry Mitchell, came into the studio and hugged me. And they just got my feet kind of back on the ground. And so anything you hear on 1A, I always want people to understand that while I'm the pointy end of the spear, there are a lot of people supporting me and surrounding me in that work. Because if it was just me, I wouldn't be able to do it. That's the honest truth. But in terms of navigating difficult conversations, I think my earliest lessons really came from watching my parents. My father was a minister. And so by default, so was my mother. And I spent a lot of time watching them talk to people, counsel people. People would come to our home often. There were always extra people at our table. And there were times when it was difficult for me as a child, as one of 7, and I didn't want to share my parents that much. But watching them spend time not trying to solve people's problems, but giving them space to just share, being present with them. Some of my earliest lessons came from watching how the two of them modeled that. And those are lessons I carry into my work today.
And so why do you think it's so hard for us to have difficult conversations now?
I think for a few reasons. One, I think we're in this time, and I can't blame all of it on social media, but we expect a prescription. It's like, follow these 17 rules, and you too can have difficult conversations. We are constantly sold quick fixes, whether it's for the way we want our skin to look, or that we want our hair to grow, or we want to lose weight, or we want to exercise, right? Use this app, use this. And so we're in this system where we've been conditioned for there to be, and that there's an answer. There is a prescriptive answer that will tell you how to do this. I think having difficult conversations is more of a practice. When I was growing up, my parents talked a lot about practicing forgiveness. I was like, well, I don't want to forgive, but I didn't really understand what that meant until I was an adult. Practicing forgiveness means just that. You are practicing. Does not mean you are perfecting it. And I think we have to learn how to approach difficult conversations in the same way. Not every conversation is going to end up the way you hope. Some conversations, you have to come to terms with the fact that you really perhaps can't have them, or you're not the person to have them. And you have to continue practicing being in that discomfort, but also being really clear about the fact that the outcome may not look like what you want it to look like.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't think we're really being conditioned to practice things in that way.
So without being too prescriptive, how do you practice it on your show?
Yeah.
When you go into a show that is about a really contentious topic, what kind of conversations are you having with your team ahead of that show?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Our team is really big on research. We want to come armed with facts, not because I'm thinking about disproving someone's point, right? It's more about a responsibility to the audience. It's about how I ensure that you are listening with clarity. Sometimes it's just a matter of knowing that someone's going to come in and they tend to do industry speak until they'll rattle off, oh, well, the FYTPD, and they'll just sort of blow past this thing. I may know what it is,
Yeah.
but most people don't, right? And so, getting them to pause or inserting what that is or making sure I circle back to say what that is. But also including the context around some of these complex issues, or having people in the conversation who can build that context in, so it's not just a one-note discussion. And I think there's a way to do that without it being contentious or disagreeable on most subjects, not always, but on most subjects. But it's research, it's very careful guest selection, being really thoughtful about who's at the table. We also have a central tenet of the show, nothing about us without us. So if we're talking about a community, that community needs to participate in the conversation. And sometimes having that real lived experience is the grounding you need to move us away from the theoretical into the real life experiences of people. Because we can talk about laws and we can talk about policies, but if there's a disconnect between what it says on the books and how it actually affects people's lives, none of us really understand what we're talking about. And so it's a very methodical approach to the discussions that we have. And again, it takes our entire team. And if we can't pull those pieces together, then that show can't go to air.
Yeah.
Like, we will push pause on something if we don't have the right people, if we feel like, this isn't ready. Because if we just go to air because we're in the news cycle, then that's a disservice to the people who are listening.
And so you have this rule, nothing about us without us, which I love and I'm going to use. But what about topics that you don't want to touch, or people that you wouldn't invite on? How do you think about that?
So I'll give you an example. She's a former producer now, and we have a very open process for our program. So everyone pitches, everyone shares ideas, everyone workshops ideas. It's a pretty democratic approach to production. Sometimes it slows things down a little bit, but it's still worthwhile. But she booked, I won't even name him, she booked a very controversial figure in the election denial circuit, let's call it that. And so we were in this meeting, and she goes, oh, by the way, I booked so-and-so. And we all just went, what? This is not an elected official. This is just someone who makes a lot of money talking about how the election was stolen. And it was this situation of the dog chasing the car and then catching the car. And everybody was like, wait, we've got the car now. And I said, there's no way we can put this person on the air live. There's absolutely no way. Frankly, I'm just from an ethical standpoint, I'm concerned that he is not mentally sound. But in addition to that, we know the misinformation, the disinformation, that is his entire platform. But we'd already committed. And so I said, we need to pre-tape this, since we've committed to the interview. Unless there's breaking news that comes out of this interview, there is little to no way we're going to use any of this tape on the show.
Yeah.
It's a dereliction of duty. If he comes on and he says, I've had a change of heart, then we will take that tape, we will go to air with it, and we will send it to Morning Edition and All Things Considered as well. That is not what happened. I was on the line with him for probably a total of 3 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, before he just devolved into this rant about, I don't even recall, but an abusive rant. And I told our engineer, we're done. We would never, under normal circumstances, book someone like that on the air.
Yeah.
We would never do it. But even now, if we are tackling a controversial topic and there's someone who maybe is a member of an administration and you don't know what they're going to say, there are techniques we can use, because it's a bit of a balancing act, because you want people to understand how the people who are making these massive decisions for all of us, how they are approaching this work, how they're thinking about it. But we have to do it in a way that's responsible. Now, are we going to just throw a random election denier or someone who doesn't believe climate change is real, or no. No, there are lines in the sand for us, and we discuss it as a team. But there are also places where there is a lot of nuance, and then it's not so much about whether we have them on or not. It's about what we do with that tape. How do we maintain control and honor our responsibility to the audience, while also making sure the audience is aware of what lawmakers and policymakers are doing and the decisions they're making.
How do you differentiate between how you approach a newsmaker interview versus someone who's just there to share their personal story? Yeah. And both things can both be hard conversations.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When it's a newsmaker interview, I mean, the thing we talk about in journalism is holding power to account. And so my responsibility in that scenario is to ensure that our audience is hearing from a policymaker, from a lawmaker, and that they are answering for the decisions they're making on our behalves, right? It's about making sure that we are hearing how you are responsible to us.
Yeah.
And that's regardless of party, regardless of the administration, that's what it is. You are responsible to our people. And one thing I love about 1A, it's one of the reasons I wanted to come to the show, is because listener engagement is such a core part of what we do. I love putting listeners' questions to politicians. Right. I love it. I love it.
Some distance.
Yeah. Well, it's not even just it's not the distance so much as it is the closeness. It's not me asking you, Senator. This is one of your constituents. This might be someone who you represent. That's as close as it gets. Yeah. You can talk about me being, fake news, or, oh, the media keeps spinning. Darling, this isn't the media. This is Brenda. Brenda wants to know. Yeah. What do you say to Brenda? And that actually makes it very close, very intimate. I love that. So there's a responsibility that we are extracting in those conversations. But when it's not an accountability interview, when it's not a lawmaker, a policymaker, when it's a personal story, I really think of my role as being one in which I'm simply facilitating the process of someone else telling their story. We try to have people on the program who aren't necessarily media trained. They're not the super polished speaker. They might say, give us a lot of ums or ahs, or they'll say, I'm really nervous. We had a conversation recently with one of the Epstein survivors. And I said, okay, we need to pre-tape this. Not because I'm really concerned about what she will say, but for her comfort.
Yeah.
And so we pre-taped, and she was so nervous. And there was a point at which she was getting very overwhelmed. And I said, okay, you know what, let's just pause.
Yeah.
Let's pause. How are you doing? How are you feeling? She's like, I don't know a lot about legal stuff. I said, you don't have to talk about anything other than the story, your story, and your story the story that you want to share. So we were able to kind of take a step back. I adjusted my approach and continued to facilitate the process of her telling her own story.
Yeah.
That's a very different interaction. Still a difficult conversation,
Yes.
but a very different interaction than what I would not pause for a pause. How are you feeling?
Right.
Yeah.
What about your role as a fact checker? We were talking about this a little bit earlier. You know, there's this balance between wanting to invite someone on to genuinely hear their perspective, and then it's hard if you have to fact check them over and over and over again. So how do you think about balancing that as a host?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really challenging in the current environment because if people are willing to say just anything, how do you fact check if it's like, wait, there were 6 things there that I'm reasonably certain were not correct,
right?
You know, and if I'm in the conversation, I'm trying to look up something and the producer's trying to look up something, it's very chaotic.
Yeah.
And so one of the approaches we take, and we did this earlier in an interview with Dr. Oz, we pre-tape that conversation. And what we were able to do was cut it into chunks and integrate pieces into the show. So this is what I asked, this is how he answered, and in one of his answers, he said, oh, well, there's this data about people who are on Medicaid and they're able-bodied and they watch TV for, I think it was like 5 or 6 hours a day. And I said, where are you getting that data from? And he said, oh, it's been reported everywhere. You know, Kaiser Family Foundation, the Heritage Foundation. And I said, oh, interesting. So we go to our panel, so freeze frame, go to our panel. One of our panelists was Julie Rovner. She's the Washington correspondent for KFF Health News, the news branch of the Kaiser Family Foundation. And I said, Julie, are you familiar with this research that Dr. Oz just cited? She's like, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And so I think it's partially about what's happening in the conversation, but also as a show, it's about how we take care of those conversations, right? Yes, we're a live show, but we also have a responsibility.
Right.
And I know my limitations. I know that I can't hold every piece of random factoid about every subject, whether it's healthcare or housing. I know my limitations. I know our producers' limitations. If we had 100 fact checkers with us every show, we might be able to do it in real time and we'd get through one question.
Right. Yeah.
You know? So part of it's about what's happening in real time, but part of it is how we treat it in a production sense as well.
Yeah. And so much about having hard conversations is about building trust too.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that if you're constantly correcting what someone's saying. So one of the things that we talked about earlier was that one of the most important tools for having hard conversations is listening and being a good listener. And so what have you learned as a host about how to listen?
Yeah, and again, I think this started really when I was much younger, watching my parents counsel people. There are so many people I talk to these days who don't feel heard. They don't feel like people really care about what they think or how they feel. And in our show in 1A, there's what's happening in the studio and the connection I have to the guest, but it's also the way people in the audience feel like they're being heard as well, because we're pulling in the questions, we're pulling in the comments, we're sharing the stories on air. And so in hosting, I'm really listening to two things at the same time. I'm listening to the conversation that's happening in the studio, and then I'm also listening to the conversation our audience is having with us. Yeah. And sometimes the audience is moving in a different direction than the conversation we have planned.
Interesting.
And so I'm almost always going to follow where the audience is going.
Was there a moment that you can think of where you really pivoted or were surprised by the reaction you were getting?
I'm trying to think. There was well, recently, we just this week did a show about the change on the black box warnings on
hormone replacement
yeah,
therapy?
on hormone replacement therapy. And there were so many questions.
Yeah.
There were so many questions. We got through maybe half of what we had planned. But there was so much concern about, it wasn't enough for them to hear from 3 doctors that, hey, this research has largely been, not even debunked, it was misunderstood.
Yeah.
We said that probably 3 times, but we were still getting so many questions. And so I had to sort of pivot away to give the doctors more time to get into the nuance, to get into what this means for your actual interaction with your doctor. What if my doctor is still nervous about prescribing this medication? What kind of questions should I be asking, right? Yeah. And so we have a whole other show that we're going to have to do now because we only got through half of what we planned.
Yeah.
But I was listening to the audience, and so I followed them.
That's great. How do you think about applying the lessons from hosting to your personal life in terms of having difficult conversations?
Yeah, it's not a direct line. It's not a direct line, and sometimes it can be problematic for the person on the other side of the conversation, because I'll default into host mode, and they're like, Jennifer, stop interviewing me. I'm like, I'm sorry, wait. But there are certain pieces of it that translate directly. One is certainly the listening part of it, which is a muscle I think you have to build. I don't think most of us have learned how to listen actively. We listen to respond. We listen to push back. We listen to, we'll have a whole other conversation going on in our head, like, I heard what you said 3 minutes ago. I got something for that, right? Like we are preparing for the next thing we're going to say rather than just being present in the conversation. So that's something I've learned to do in hosting, and I've again, it's a practice. And so I definitely bring that into my everyday life. But the other part of it is just the curiosity I think you have to have for this job. There have been so many personal conversations I've had. One recently that didn't actually end positively to my perspective. It left me with a lot of discomfort that I'm still processing. But getting into this practice of always asking one more question. So you think you've asked all the things you need to know, but before you try to do something or say something, is there one more question you can ask? Can you push your curiosity just a little further? Because sometimes it's that question that really reveals the underbelly or the heart of the issue. And because most of us, I think, aren't, again, socialized or learned the skills of active listening, being actively curious, asking questions. If you have those skills or you want to practice them, it's really incumbent on you, because the other person likely isn't going to do it because they don't know how.
Yeah.
But what you can do is model a different approach to conversations that maybe someone can pick up on. And if you open that space, or even invite them then. Say, I feel like I've been asking you a lot of questions. What do you want to ask me? Like before you respond to anything they say, do you have questions for me? And give them a chance to ask you questions. So rather than answering, I think we need to be asking more. And it's hard because the answers we get are not always pretty or simple. They can be hurtful. And I'm not of the mind that we are responsible for absorbing purposeful pain. I'm not of that mind. But I think if you want to practice this, and if there are relationships and situations where you feel like it's beneficial to open this space, there are ways to do it, but I think you just have to really be prepared.
Yeah.
You really have to settle into this space of, I'm doing this because I want to know. Mm-hmm. I want to understand.
And so on the air, when you feel things getting heated or escalating, especially in a live environment, with a panel, let's say, of different voices, how do you de-escalate or turn down the temperature?
A lot of it has to do with my energy.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with me. And I've been told often, Jennifer, every time you're so soothing. I'm like, I don't know if that's good. I don't want you going to sleep, but I try to lead and I control the conversation. Yeah. Like look, it's my show.
Yeah.
And if you're just going off, I'll have the engineer pull your mic down. I will, right? You're not, it's, God bless some of these folks who are doing like these roundtables on cable news. We have control over the microphone on our show. I love audio. And so sometimes it is just the practical pulling someone down and saying, guest, I understand you have a lot you want to share, but I want to hear from so-and-so.
Yeah.
And just taking control, wrestling back control of the conversation. And not doing it in a way that's rude or anything like that, but just to make it clear to them, there is someone driving the bus. Yeah, I'm driving the bus.
Yeah.
And it's time for you to have a seat. We're going to let guest B talk, and you'll have a chance to respond.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, well, that seems like a good place to turn it over to the audience. We will take questions, and we have mics going around, so feel free to raise your hand.
One of the things that you started this interview with was a story about a vulnerable situation. One of the things, as an observer of you, you can be vulnerable on the air. But that's a decision that you make. How do you have insight into what it takes to expose yourself?
Yeah. One of the things we learn early on as journalists is that we're not supposed to be the story. And there are times when the vulnerability I expose on air is happening very much against my will. It's not me. There was a moment today when we had an Afghan refugee on the air, and he and his family, they got their green cards last week. And he was talking about what would happen to other Afghans who worked with the U.S. if they were forced to return to Afghanistan under Taliban rule. And I said, what does this mean for them? And he said, in a word, death. And he went on to talk about if they hadn't gotten those green cards a week ago, the decisions he and his family would be making right now, what that would be like. And it was just a gut punch. It just hit me. And in that situation, I had, a minute and a half in between segments to gather myself. But there are times when I don't have that time. and it just happens. But then there are other times when I'm really deliberate about sharing my personal story on air because it makes space for other people's stories. A couple of years ago, I was finally diagnosed with a condition I didn't know I had had probably for most of my life, called adenomyosis. And I was going to have to be off air for several weeks recovering from surgery. And I was talking to our executive producer. I was like, okay, how do we explain my absence? Because people start to get nervous if people go missing. And I said, you know, I had this experience with the medical system where I was just undiagnosed for years. For years. I was just put on this medication or that medication. They didn't do the additional testing for years. And now I have to have surgery, major surgery. And so we use that, my story, as the starting point to talk about women's experiences with the medical system. And when I tell you we were inundated, inundated with calls and emails and texts, not just from women, but from men talking about their mothers and their sisters and the lives that were lost because pain was ignored. It just opened up the floodgates. It launched a whole series on the show called In Good Health. That was the starting point for it. But it was a decision that I made not because I could make the story about me, but because I could open the door for what I knew were thousands, if not millions, of other people's stories. So if I can make that connection, then I can give myself permission to open up in that way.
Really interesting. One of our previous speakers in this series was a friend of mine, Martin Rivas, who wrote a book about the history of the like button. And which happened around 2010, 2011. How has social networks in general, social media, but the like button, the share button, how has it changed the context of your work and your interviews?
Oh, that's, wow. So my younger producers will tell you that I am terrible at social media. I'm terrible at it. And I think because I don't engage deeply in that world, it doesn't drive content on the show. And this goes back to our executive producer who retired earlier this year. It's very easy to build a show around what people are talking about online. Yeah. And that's not what we do. That's not what we do. We have to use it as a tool for promotion, for reaching new audiences, and at times for sourcing the show. It's been really interesting going into some of these Reddit channels where there are former federal workers who have gathered, or people who share an interest, and we can go into those channels and say, hey, we're looking for guests or sources, or we're doing this show, send us your questions. So it's a tool for us in terms of outreach, which is great. But we've been deliberate about not letting it drive our content. And even insofar as, when I started with the show, we were still present on Facebook. We were present on what was then Twitter. And when I would go to our Facebook page, I saw how the comments would just devolve into madness. And we didn't have the bandwidth to moderate that. And I said, look, this is not reflective of our show. The conversation that is having in the comments, if someone was to come here, they would never listen to this show because they think this is who we are. And this isn't who we are. We can't do that. When Twitter switched hands and we saw how moderation was going to work there, I said, we can't do it. This is not who we are. And so we have responded to changes in social media, but we don't let it drive our brand, and we don't let it drive our conversations. Because, I see it happening in other places, and I think it would just be a huge disservice to our listeners. They expect a certain thing from us. And if we move in that direction, we'll be moving away from what the audience expects.
Back there.
Thank you for doing this. Two questions kind of related. One is in terms of the preparation you do, the research you do to hold multiple one-hour segments every week, that process must be fascinating, and you must have an incredible ability to absorb and compartmentalize. And relatedly, as your interviews are going on, if you have a panel, I get it. You've got the different points of view sitting there. But when it's you and one guest, is someone in your ear in real time telling you that's not right, or we know because of this other authoritative source?
So to answer the first question first, we have 10 hours of show a day. Oh, Lord God, a day. That was a Freudian slip. 10 hours a week, and I host 8 of those hours. The Friday News Roundup, we have a rotation there. Each producer owns an hour of the show, and they curate prep material for me. So it may be articles or interviews. If it's a documentary, I'm watching the documentary. If it's a book, I'm doing my best to read the book, especially if it's a one-on-one author interview. I want to read the book. So usually what happens is I come out of that prep material with questions of my own. And so that requires then additional research. So it's like, okay, there's this step, but what about this other issue? What do we know? So it's what they prepare, and then it's what I need to fill the cracks in on for myself. And sometimes that has to happen in the space of 24, 48 hours. Sometimes we have a little bit more time to do it because, again, it may be a book or something that we just have a little more lead time on. My short-term memory is pretty clutch. My long-term memory, not so much. I couldn't tell you what we did on the show a month ago, but every now and then I'll be at dinner with someone and some random factoid about the American flag will pop out of my mouth. I'm like, where did that come from? But it's stored back there some way. So yeah, there is a lot of compartmentalization and having to sort of be able to turn the corner, not even just day by day, but really hour to hour. And then the second question you asked was about if there's someone in my ear. So the way our setup is, I'm in the studio. We have our engineer in the control room behind glass, and then the producer who's line producing. And that producer is doing a few things. They're sending engagement my way, so going through emails and texts. Sometimes in the conversation, I also have multiple screens. So there are times when they'll say something and I'm like, and I can fact check it myself. Sometimes it's fact checks that we have already prepared in advance because we know the typical direction of the conversation. So I'll have maybe a one sheet for myself where I can just pull numbers or whatever. Sometimes because of the pace of the conversation, I'll just message the producer. They're not in my ear. Message the producer, look this up for me, and then they can drop it in the chat. So I have the chat where the listener engagement is coming in. I have a chat going with the producer. There's a separate Slack chat where we're recording things that may need to be retried. There are a lot of things happening all at the same time. So it's juggling, and there are times when it's like complicated. So it's not a yes or no. It's like yes but or yes and. And so when we need to do maybe a little more context to something, we might not get that until 5 or 10 minutes later. But I'll say, earlier in the show, so-and-so and so stated, here's a little more context for that. So to the best of our ability, we try to get it right. It's really hard in live radio. And I don't know that people realize how much of what you listen to is not live. But in a live context, it's challenging. But we'll do it on air. Sometimes we'll add that context on the website. Or if we're recutting it for a rebroadcast or for what we call 1A+, which some stations run later in the day, we'll add that context there. So, yeah, we try to catch everything. I can't promise that things don't get through, but we certainly try.
Hosts are amazing multitaskers. As the person on the other side of the glass, it is amazing the amount of incoming that they are managing while engaging deeply in a conversation with someone else.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for this and for your show. How would you have a conversation if the other party is not willing to have one, but it's really important to hear their perspective?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is sometimes the conversation may be necessary, but we may not be the person to have the conversation. We may not be the right messenger. And it can be difficult, especially if it's a close personal relationship, but accepting that I want to understand this, but I may not be the person who can draw this out. So is there someone else? Is there someone else I can partner with who perhaps has an easier entry point? That would be the first thing I'd say. And then the second thing is, and it gets back to this idea of practice, I think sometimes people are unwilling to engage in conversations because they don't know the rules of engagement. Right? You're like, I want to talk to you about this thing. And to you, it sounds like, I want to talk to you about this thing. And to them, they hear, I want to tell you why all the things you believe are wrong. And sometimes when we lay out the rules of engagement for someone up front, and we tell them very clearly what we are expecting or what we're hoping to have happen in that conversation. Listen, I'm not looking for an outcome. I don't want to change your mind. I just want to listen. In fact, yeah, I don't really want to have a conversation about this. I just want to listen to you. I'm going to listen to you talk about your perspective. Can we do that for 10 minutes? Now, what that means is that you have to be willing to follow the rules of engagement that you set. And that means that no matter how uncomfortable it gets and how squirmy you feel, you got to sit in that discomfort because you set the rules of engagement. And for those 10 minutes, you said you were going to listen. And so you got to listen. It's that trust piece of it. And so if you're able to do that, and you've got that first little nugget of trust because they're like, wow, they actually sat there and listened to me for 10 minutes. Does that open the door to a second conversation or to a second listening session? But be really clear about the outcome. Be really honest with yourself about the outcome you're seeking. If it's really about understanding, can you set rules of engagement that are simply about that and nothing else?
Yes, certainly some of the most controversial and hostile issues today involve race, whether it's DEI or hate crimes. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, when you wrote Breaking Mississippi, did that impact your approach to conversations on 1A, or did your experience on 1A help you to have conversations in the Deep South?
Oh, are you referring to the podcast, the BBC podcast?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. For a minute, I was like, I didn't write a book yet. So Breaking Mississippi is a podcast that I worked with the BBC on about a desegregation of University of Mississippi, of Ole Miss. And so I'll be very transparent here. They actually just reached out to me to be a voice and basically an advisor on the podcast. I didn't do the reporting for that. The reporting was already done by a lovely gentleman in Ireland who got interested in the story because his experience with the conflicts in Ireland. And so he brought the story to me and said, I'd really love your perspective on this, and would you be willing to be the voice? And I said, well, show me what you have and let's talk about it. And so we did, and we talked through it, and there was some nuance that we had to build in together. And then we produced the podcast. But I think you're absolutely right that some of the most challenging conversations this country has yet to have are about race. And I think there are two really difficult things about it. First is that it's deeply painful. My parents grew up, my dad in Georgia, my mother in Mississippi. They were born in the Jim Crow South. And there were so many stories they didn't tell us until we were adults. We'd sit around the dinner table, and all of a sudden my father would share this story about how the sheriff came to their house and shot my uncle. And we're like, wait, what? And when we'd ask them, why didn't you tell us this when we were younger? They'd say, because we didn't want you to hate white people. There is a deep trauma attached to that history that we just have not created space for as a nation. But I think the other challenge is that it is closer than we like to admit. That history is right on our heels. And I think there's a deep discomfort with acknowledging that truth. We're not talking about my great-great-grandparents. These are my parents. My 3 oldest siblings were born in this country at a time when they didn't have full rights. They wouldn't be able to vote. They were born before the Civil Rights Act. That history is right on our heels. And it's like we just keep trying to outrun it. But it's our shadow, so we can't. We can't. And I know there are people who are trying to do the work of having those difficult conversations with mixed success, but I am confident that if this nation breaks, that issue will be at the root. It will be at the root.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. At one point, you were discussing like when things get too heated and like you just pull their mic. How do you know as a host that line between like, okay, things are getting hot, but this is productive, this is interesting, this is contentious, but it's good, versus like, okay, everyone's just yelling, like everyone just needs to calm down.
Yeah, because there's a point at which it stops being an exchange of ideas. There is. Do you have siblings? Okay, all right. And so when I'm in an argument with siblings, and it's like, well, you were supposed to do it. Well, I didn't want to do the dishes. I did it. Okay, well, fine, you do. Fine. Well, I love you too, right? Like there's still this exchange happening, but you can feel the difference between people talking to each other passionately and talking at each other. And so as a host, what I'm listening for is that line. It's like, oh, these people are not talking to each other anymore. They're not. And that's when I have to step in and start pulling mics down, pulling microphones down. But I think it's true in our conversations with one another as well. We know what it feels like when we're not being heard. And if we're honest with ourselves, we also know when we've stopped listening. And that's the point, as the person who is in the practice of having difficult conversations, we can perhaps lead us to a different outcome, lead one another to a different outcome, and allow space for there to be a return to that conversation because it hasn't devolved to this point of no return.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing, and I think a testament to just how, I don't know, maybe appreciated sometimes being a host can be, because with everything that has to be juggled, all the chats that you have, I said, wow, I don't have to do that in my role, my goodness. Thank you so very much. Another round of applause, please, for Jenn White and Natalie Winston. Amazing. And thank you all so much for joining us. If you have not done so already, be sure to head over to planetwordmuseum.org and sign up for our newsletter, so that way you'll get the latest info and updates on upcoming programs and events. So make sure you guys do that, okay? Thank you once again. Have an amazing evening. We'll see you all next time.